friends, I'm excited because, as I said before, one of my favorite music writers is coming on today to talk about his book and maybe some other things. I ask as I do gotcha journalism. Friends, welcome to the show, Chris DeVille. Let's see. Let me make you there. Oh, there you are.
Here I am.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining. I've been showing people it, but author most recently of Such Great Heights, the complete cultural history of the indie rock explosion. And for everyone who in the next few minutes hears you talk about it and decides they need it, there's a link in the description to the bookshop.org version, free shipping today if you get it, which is really nice. And you're not supporting Amazon and you're supporting a good book. Is that
Yeah.
Did I tell people to use Bookshop and not Amazon?
Yeah. Bookshop sounds great. I'll take the sales where I can get it, but
Yeah.
I think that no, maybe there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, but Bookshop seems like a good way to do it and have a clear conscience.
Yeah, why not? And just a beautiful covered book as well. So I highly recommend people get this. But I'm going to ask you some questions about it, if that's okay. Most
Fantastic.
boring question, which I'll hopefully get out of the way right off the bat. Boring only because I'm sure you've been asked this a bazillion times. But what led to you deciding to write a book about this particular moment? You described it as the indie rock explosion. I think it's basically like the early 2000s, old millennial era explosion of indie rock music as a popular thing. What was the genesis of you deciding to write a whole book on this?
Well, there's a few factors. One is it's like a write what you know
Uh-huh.
situation. Like this is the thing that I have been obsessed with for basically my entire adult life. And I managed to get work writing about it and cling to work writing about it for the last decade plus. And so there was some aspect of it was like, I would really like to write a book. And this is something that I love writing about and know a lot about. But also, so the book, the subtitle is a complete cultural history of the indie rock explosion. But while I was writing the book, I was working under the subtitle How Indie Rock Went Pop.
Uh-huh.
And I thought that it was interesting. I hadn't seen a lot of like any really book length coverage of like the early 2010s. And so a lot of the book covers the 2000s, but it ends in the 2010s. And that was really a driving force for me for writing the book was like, I thought it was so fascinating, sort of the way that indie as a concept, as a scene evolved to the point where when I started working for Stereo Gum in 2013, you had like, all these indie branded pop stars. You had indie music fans seemed like they were more interested in rap and R&B than in indie rock, like in the guitar driven sense.
Mhm.
And then all that stuff was still going on, but in terms of like the zeitgeist and sort of like where the hipster taste was going at the time, and even to the point where like in 2020 when Taylor Swift made Folklore and she worked with Aaron Dessner from the
Mhm.
National, people called it her indie album. And it's like, if the Taylor Swift album that is like the biggest album of the year is indie, then like, what does indie even mean anymore? And so I was thinking about like stuff like that, stuff like Carly Rae Jepsen playing
Mhm.
Pitchfork Music Festival, like the 1975 becoming like a critical darling, sort of the boy band version of an indie band. One of my favorite bands. So like I'm not hating, and
Yeah.
but I did think it was fascinating, like the gulf between like Pavement and the 1975. And so like I was kind of working my way backwards from that to think about like how did we get to that point. And so yeah, it was a lot of like, well, let's look at the mainstream breakthrough of indie rock in the 2000s and how that might have sort of the intermingling between indie rock and the mainstream and how that the effect that it had on indie rock itself.
Yeah. I mean, something I really enjoyed about this book when I compare it to another music book from, I guess it came out a while ago now, Meet Me in the Bathroom. I'm forgetting the name of the author. I bet you know it.
Lizzie Goodman.
Yes. But a book that kind of charts that late 90s, early 2000, like New Yorkie rock scene.
Mm-hmm.
Reading that book, I felt like I was reading a cultural ethnography of a place that I never participated in. I was never, doing coke in a New York bar in the late 90s as like Tom Jonathan Fire Eater played a set or something like that. It's something I was very removed from. And that book paints a very like specific moment, and it kind of ends in a weird way where a lot of your book picks up with kind of, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, like what we think of as modern indie music. But something I loved in your book is you both write about the music, but you interweave your own personal history. You talk about going to shows and moments you've experienced, which is great because I feel like, for me at least, just to make it all about me, many of those experiences overlapped with my own. So it was really fun reading it. And I think for a lot of people, maybe more so than people who reading a book like Meet Me in the Bathroom, they can feel like I was there for this, or like, oh, he was at that show, I was at another show on this tour, or whatever it might have been. I wonder if, and you talk about a lot of moments of you experiencing live music in this book. Are there one or two that stand out to you, or things like when you were writing this and kind of going back and recounting all those experiences? Do you have any particular shows or moments that really congealed in your soul why this era and genre is so important to you?
Oh man, well, I do mention some of them in the book. I'm not sure how early in the book I talk about uh, going to see the band The Dismemberment Plan like 7 times in a year. It was
This
right.
was all a setup for me to see if I could get you to talk about the Dismemberment Plan so that I didn't bring it up and you did, but keep
Okay.
going. But
Yeah,
I'm
so
excited about that.
that one was really important to me in terms of like, oh wow, you can kind of like get out there, and this band is accessible enough that I can like be standing by the stage and see them. Uh, and they're cool and weird, and they're like catchy and accessible in some ways. But they're also like, I mean, they were having people come up on the stage and dance with them like before Girl Talk was ever a thing. And so having this like kind of close relationship with that band as a fan and going to see them a bunch, that was huge for me. That was also like how I ended up learning about like Fort Reno in Washington D.C., which is like this park where they throw free indie rock and punk shows every summer. And like I went to the Dismemberment Plan. It was supposed to be their farewell show at Fort Reno, and then it was rained, so they did another farewell show at the 930 Club, and I went to that. Also, I was driving from Ohio for all of these shows.
Amazing.
Uh, but yeah, so that whole segment. I mean, my whole college, it was just like I was at Ohio University in Southeast
Mhm.
Ohio from 2002 to 2006, and I was just driving all over the Midwest to go see shows. Another one I talk about in the book is seeing Arcade Fire at the Mercury Lounge in New York. We kind of poo-poo them now for many reasons,
Yeah.
but at the time it was one of the greatest shows I'd ever seen, and it was like that band is probably like the success story from 2000s indie rock, like in terms of they had some classic albums. They broke through to become a household name. They won the Grammy for Album of the Year. Like they were really looming over everything. And so being able to see them sort of at the ground level in a really small venue when they were about to blow up, and they're like still kind of wild and crazy at that time, like playing drums on each
Yeah.
other's
Yeah.
heads and stuff. So that was amazing. And I guess in terms of later in the book, I talk about one of the chapters is about the indie rock fans' interaction with hip hop.
Hmm.
And I talk a little bit about Odd Future in that chapter. And it's like going to see Odd Future in uh, at South by Southwest right when they were blowing up. And they were also just sort of totally crazy. People were moshing all over the place, people were bleeding.
Oh.
Members of the group were like stage diving off of the roof of this amphitheater. And uh yeah, that was an incredible experience. That I mean, that's not as much like I was already like obsessed with indie rock, and that's not even indie rock really. It became, as I talk about in the book, it kind of came under the umbrella of indie,
Hmm.
even though it wasn't like indie rock per se. Um, but that was another amazing live music experience that was like, I think the energy that I felt going to indie rock shows in, when I was first getting into it, and the excitement that I felt as like a college student, I continued to feel that excitement at, stuff like Odd Future
Mhm.
later on. So yeah, I mean, we could keep going with concert stories,
No,
but
that's great. And I mean, if there was 2 points in the book where I got really excited early on and felt like I liked you very much as a person, one was when you described, well, you talk about like the politics of being on the school bus in like the late 90s and the sort of rap rock versus boy band crowd. And I remember like almost getting in a fight where I would have gotten beat up, to be clear, because I was like, I said something bad about corn to a guy in a corn t-shirt and Jinkos and like a chain wallet. And he got real mad at me. But that felt relatable. And you talked about as well being on like the cross country team in high school. And I was also I think I'm 1 year younger than you based on your school timeline. But I was also a, cross country runner in the suburbs, obsessed with a lot of these bands. So I was already all in on you. And then seeing how much you love the Dismemberment Plan in the book really did it for me. Because they're one of those bands personally who, like, you look back on that era, and I feel like there were times where there's bands that seemed like they were destined to be underground forever that blew up. And even like early Arcade Fire, like the first time I saw them live, I
mhm.
wouldn't have predicted them being like an arena band, like the U2 of a generation or something. And then at the same time, like I remember when the first Postal Service record came out, I wouldn't have imagined that 20 years later they were doing 3 sold out nights at the Hollywood Bowl,
Yeah,
celebrating that. But the Dismemberment Plan, I feel like, is a weird one because they are not discussed a lot. But for my money, they're one of the most musically interesting bands of that era. And you describe being on stage. It might have been 2002, but the last on one of their like farewell tours, I saw them at the Social in Orlando, Florida when I was in high school. And they did the like letting people get on stage and like had some like maracas and stuff they were passing around. And it was probably one of the best moments of my life.
yeah,
But then they just kind of vanished. I know that
yeah.
Travis
The
Morrison's got
timing.
stuff, but why? I mean, do you have any theory for why Dismemberment Plan is one of those bands that, for some of us, are one of the most important bands ever, but feels like they've kind of faded from the collective memory?
They chose to break up. I think 2003, and it was sort of like they were just aging
Yeah,
out of the whole touring grind. But it was just, it's so funny or sad, it's so interesting. Like the year before that, they were co-headlining a tour with Death Cab for Cutie,
unreal.
and then like in 2003, Death Cab for Cutie gets strapped to a rocket because of the OC,
Yeah,
and meanwhile, the Dismemberment Plan is winding down. But they were also so predictive of what was going to happen. Like I talk about them in the second chapter of the book because they were bringing this dance party aspect to indie rock, years before a lot of other bands were. They were engaging with pop and R&B and stuff in a non-ironic way, and yet at the same time they were still very much like a weird indie rock band. I feel like, yeah, if they would have kept going for just a little while longer and like released another album around the time of like Franz Ferdinand and Block
mhm.
Party, like maybe they would have uh, really taken off. But it's hard to say. I think at least they are pretty well known amongst, like, I think they're really well regarded now. They have their core fan
Mhm.
base, and when they do their reunions, it's like they draw a good crowd. Uh, they're able to headline some festivals and sort of get their flowers. But it is kind of sad that they weren't able to like take advantage of that blow up moment.
Yeah. Although at least they were just guys that then, as far as I understand, went and worked jobs and were normal dudes, and not a band that fizzed out because of addiction or personal problems or anything like that. I remember because
Yeah,
I feel like some of them like worked in IT in the DC area. Were just kind of normal guys.
they did keep making music. Like, I mean, a couple of them were in a band with Davey from The Promise Ring
Oh
for a little
man.
while,
Okay.
and Travis, of course, like was
Mhm.
pursuing a solo career, and that's a whole subplot in the book with talking about like Pitchfork's
Yes.
notorious takedown of Travis's solo album. Um, but yeah, it's true. They basically kind of retired into normal life, and then they reemerge every few years to make their fans very happy by playing some shows
Yeah.
again. Um,
Well, maybe
so
the pitchfork thing is a helpful point here for me to stop just being like Chris Farley in that one SNL thing, just wanting to talk about the Dismemberment Plan. But Pitchfork is another thing for those of us in a certain age that like was a thing once that feels completely different from what like the thing is now. Especially for the younger folks watching this, Pitchfork was a thing at a certain point when I was in high school. Like you would go to the website and there'd be some record you'd never heard of, given a 8.9 or something, and you would go to your local indie rock record store and hope that they have a copy. And in many ways, would just like build these hype machines around a lot of weird bands you'd never heard of, or noisier bands, or more experimental bands. But like you said, they also had this kiss of death thing where with the Travis Morrison record, you give that a bad review, it's done. I remember one of my favorite bands. I remember when there was the I think it was either the Ghost is Born or the Sky Blue Sky Wilco review.
oh, it's Sky Blue Sky.
Yeah, that was like the devastating dad rock takedown. There was this power that they had, but you look at it now, and there'll be like a feature on Taylor Swift's influences sponsored by Sam Pellegrino or whatever. And I get it, like everyone has to live and make stuff work digitally, but I think aesthetically, you talk about indie meaning different things. There was a point where I think a website like Pitchfork represented a certain aesthetic of like independent bands coming out of the post-punk or experimental scenes. Indie slowly then became kind of an aesthetic modifier that just meant like rock music that wasn't hard rock or alternative rock or something. And then slowly at the same time, and you've mentioned this, you talk about this in your book, there is an era where Pitchfork didn't talk about rap music or R&B music. In many ways, it was just like white bands. And one would go to like, Nah Right or Dat Piff or various websites to look at rap music stuff. And then all of a sudden Pitchfork would write these essays about some Louisiana trap rappers mixtape where a white guy that looks like one of us is like waxing poetic about the
Mm-hmm.
lyricism of someone. Um, what do you account for that kind of transition, and I don't know if this is where like the poptimism things comes into play, but it felt like such a drastic shift.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly Poptimism had something to do with it. Like, and I've been saying this a lot. I did not want the book to be some sort of anti-Poptimist screed.
Yeah, it
Like,
doesn't come off like that.
that's good because I like a lot of. I think there are some really good things that came out of Poptimism, and I think that in terms of like indie music becoming poppier or like an offshoot, the public facing version of indie music becoming poppier. Like there's a lot of bands like that I love. Like, I mean, I think most people would call Haim an indie band, even though like they're not really indie according to anything other than like their audience.
Yeah.
Like, but like I love that. I love that band. So yeah, I think, in terms of what drove changes at Pitchfork, there was definitely a desire to want to represent more than, just this limited perspective. Uh, you had this sort of critical idea taking hold that like all these genres that were dismissed as fluffy or insubstantial before, the reasons for doing that were, maybe rooted in, prejudice,
Mm-hmm.
rooted in like, not it flawed thinking, and that everything basically deserves a fair shake. But there was definitely a rush to show how eclectic you could be, I think. And I think bef- maybe like the stereotypical hipster posture went from like having all these super obscure things that I like to like I like all these super obscure things and all these really popular
Mm-hmm.
things, and look how many multitudes I contain. And so I think that that was definitely driving some of it. And I think there was some legitimate uh at a certain point, if you're looking around and you're saying the most exciting music that's being made in the world is all being made by like nerdy collegiate white people, like you probably do want to broaden your
Yeah.
perspective to a certain extent. Even if the people who were doing most of the writing there were still like nerdy collegiate
Nerdy
white
collegiate white
people.
people,
I mean,
yeah.
like my coworker at Stereogum, Tom Bryan, is
Uh-huh.
like, he was one of the guys who was bringing mainstream hip hop coverage into Pitchfork in
Yeah.
those days. And, he is like a white guy with glasses who looks like us, except for he's 7 feet tall.
Damn.
But you should read his book, The Number Ones, too, by the way. It's been out for a few years now, but it's really good. So yeah, I don't know. There's so many factors in play in terms of like the shifts that I was trying to cover in the book. And uh Pitchfork definitely drove a lot of those, or was, a lot of the phenomena that I was charting, they intersected with Pitchfork in some way. But I mean, I think one of my biggest takeaways while writing the book was just like what a complex situation it
Mhm.
was. Like there were technological factors, there were critical philosophical trends, there was fashion, uh talk a little bit about American Apparel and Urban
Mhm.
Outfitters and stuff. And so yeah, it was like there was sort of so much going on. And that, coming back to your original question, that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, was because I felt like there was a story that I sort of understood intuitively just from living it and from spending a lot of time thinking about it professionally, but it wasn't really like documented in a hard copy. Like a lot of, as you move, as if you're talking about indie rock history online, it's like a lot of the old websites are like gone now.
Yeah.
Like you got a bunch of, it's a story that was told through dead links. And you can find some of them on the Wayback Machine. I don't think I could have written the book without the Wayback Machine. Certainly, like I talk about Hipster Runoff
Uh-huh.
sometimes in the book, and it's like that site is not online anymore, but thankfully most of its posts are archived at the Wayback Machine. So yeah, there was also that desire to kind of get this stuff written down in a way that it couldn't just be taken offline.
Yeah. I mean, and something that I love about the book is the element at which it feels like almost like a cultural and economic ethnography of an era, and the way you provide context. And some of it too is like I was in my early 20s, which is so long ago. I was someone that was like resentful towards poptimism and like having to be told that I needed to listen to like Carly Rae Jepsen or whatever it was. Um, but in the book, like I think you point out some very important things about how there's a history of disregarding art made by people that aren't from a dominant, social or racial group, and how importantly that plays into stuff. Another part of the book that I really loved, as someone who once watched the whole show in a summer, is how something like the OC had this drastic effect on indie music and what got popular and all that sort of stuff. So I think for folks who maybe weren't even as into the music, I think the way you chart this time and, like you said, connect the fashion to the TV to the economics to some of the cultural biases adds a lot of depth, and to me at least like helped me recontextualize things from that era. So it was fun to go back and like revisit thoughts I had 20 years ago via your book.
Yeah, that was something I was really trying to do. My editor at St. Martin's was really wise about that. Like she was helping me to tease out like the connections to broader pop culture as much as possible, because we wrote it, it ended up writing it in a way where hopefully anybody who lived through this era will be able to read it and identify with it, even if they weren't like, I mean, if you were like really in these streets and you were like reading the blogs and you were logging on to like the Hipinion message board and stuff, like then you certainly will remember this stuff. But I think that the hope was to really highlight a lot of these big, more mainstream kind of moments in indie music and connect them to things that people will remember, even if they weren't like going to a lot of like, Sufjan Stevens concerts or something. Like, so yeah, one of the biggest things was tech. Like, I mean, it really was like a through line for the story that was being told, in terms of going from like Napster and early web publishing, uh, certainly Pitchfork being a big part of that, on into the iTunes and MySpace era and music MP3 blogs, and then moving on to Tumblr and social media and streaming. Like all of those things had a major effect on indie rock. And so the book ended up being kind of a shadow history of
Mhm.
the internet and kind of the tech side of music. I mean, I don't get deep into like, this is how MySpace happened or whatever. Like, actually, my friend Michael Tedder wrote a whole book about the history of
Mhm.
MySpace that you should also check out.
Yeah.
But
No, that's great. And it does. Like you do show the kind of interaction between technology and economics and how those shape both the consumption and production of music. And I think now a lot of us are used to hearing more and more like not cool, terrible, depressing stories about how hard it is for like meant in the kind of capital I sense, how hard it is for indie rock musicians to survive economically right now. And even in a way too, your book kind of charts the difference between an era where listening to music meant spending $13 at a store to an era where listening to music meant like worst case scenario monthly fee for infinite music, or in most places just listening to whatever you want for free, and how that changes the way we value those things.
yeah, yeah, that was some. Oh, go ahead.
Oh well, no, go ahead. I have one more question for you after that, and I'll let you get going because I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, I was just gonna say that was definitely the accessibility of it and the sort of the cheapness of it. I mean, that is something that you know the financial element of all this. Also, you're right; it kind of lingers throughout the story in different ways. But yeah, I'm curious. What was your last question?
Okay, so my last question for you is, the book charts a certain era, a life, a death, a rebirth of sorts. I'm wondering, as a music writer, what you think about the moment we're in right now, because from an amateur music fan POV, I kind of feel like more optimistic about, I'll say, indie rock or like guitar music than I have in a while. And it felt like there was a period, again, this is all old guy shit I'm about to say, but 5 or 6 years ago, where there was music coming out that I liked made by young folks, but a lot of it was more experimental R&B or techno inflected, whatever. And now, like in the past 2 weeks, two of the records I've been listening to on loop are the new Wednesday album and the new Geese record. Rock albums made by people whose ages start with two, or in the case of Geese, I feel like their ages just barely start with two.
Mhm.
Um, and it makes me feel kind of excited that there's this era where young people are making something that's both reflective of a certain aesthetic, but doesn't feel like they're just repeating, what happened a generation before. It's like a kind of modern version of that. So you can either kill my optimism or qualify it, but I'm wondering what you think about the thing that we can refer to as indie rock and its current existence, and kind of where you see rock music, right now as we approach the end of 2025.
I mean, it's definitely in a healthy place in terms of creatively. The two bands that you just mentioned are obviously like two of the biggest success stories in terms of breaking through, you're kind of out of the hype machine noise, like breaking through to like an actual audience. And I was telling somebody else about this today. I think that those bands in particular, they signify a hunger for something that's a little weirder, more abrasive, not sanitized, like because we had the return of guitars, like we had a new wave of guitar bands in the 2010s, uh, but it wasn't like agitation. It
Mhm.
wasn't like Geese, Cameron Winter. He's like really an acquired taste, and the
Yeah.
same with Carly from Wednesday. Really, like I thought her voice was great. And then like I was listening to what I thought was their poppiest song with my wife, and she was like, "What is with this voice?" And
I had
so
that record on with my wife and my mother-in-law the other day. I forget what song it was on, but it was one where like it's very nice, and then she's screaming in the last chorus,
mhm.
and all of a sudden they're like, "What the hell is this?" Whereas I'm
Yeah,
like, "This is
yeah.
pathos. This is an artist that fucking cares."
Right. And so it's like I think there's a hunger for music that is not it doesn't go down quite so smooth.
Yeah.
Like streaming has really prioritized that sort of more sanitized the music that can just be passively consumed. And what we're seeing now, I think, is like a groundswell of support for bands that push back against that.
Yeah.
And so in terms of the economics of being an indie band, I think things are pretty bleak. I feel like we're at a
Yeah.
point where like the whole music industry and certainly the indie rock music industry, it feels like it's coming to a place where it can only be practiced as like a side hustle or something, except for in rare cases. And that includes journalism too. It's like I'm lucky to have a full-time job
Yeah.
writing about music with a a focus on indie rock day to day. That's like exceedingly rare at this point. And a lot of the best coverage of indie rock is coming from like people who have an email newsletter and they just like do it when they get home from their day job. And so, I mean, some people might argue that that's a positive, like, trying to see the silver lining, like taking the careerism out of it. But yeah, I don't really know what the way forward is in terms of, sort of making sure that the culture and the scene or whatever persists. But if whenever people get really excited about new bands, there's always people who are willing to throw money behind that. So maybe we're due for like another type of explosion. I think that the post Geese bands, the bands that are trying to like Jack Geese's swagger, are going to be so bad. But
Oh, that's a tough one to copy. Yeah. Oh,
um, but yeah, I think maybe hopefully the lesson learned from Geese and Wednesday is that like there is an audience for like risk taking
yeah.
music that's a little bit weird and a little bit abrasive and takes big swings and isn't just content to like sound nice at Chipotle. And
Chipotle rock. I love it. Well, I know that was my last question, but I'll maybe just say this as a way to say bye. You did mention, that you are lucky enough to still have a job writing about music full time. You talked about uh, newsletters and stuff. So maybe you can just give us some recommendations on the way out, along with Stereo Gum and your work. I do think a thing that sucks for younger people now is they don't have the thing that we had when we were young, which is like the 4 websites or message boards you could go to.
mhm.
What we now have is ChatGPT making Spotify playlists for people. So for people who want to do a better job or pay more attention to what's going on in music, they should follow your work. They should definitely read your book. But who are some music writers and newsletters and stuff like that you might just throw out that people could check out?
Oh man. Okay. I like Josh Terry has a weekly newsletter
Of
called
course you said that one. Sorry, I just that's it's also a favorite of mine. So
Yeah, no
um, yeah,
expectations. He has a very particular like personal, like there's definitely like Josh Terry type bands. But if you read it for a while, you kind of come to understand it.
yeah.
He does good.
And I'm linking that in the chat right now. Anyone who's listening, if you want to check that out now.
I really like Larry Fitzmaurice,
Mhm.
formerly of Pitchfork and some other places. He has one called Last Donut of the Night where he does a lot of interviews. I mean, like Josh will sometimes do interviews, but the No Expectations one is a lot of times like, here is like 5 new albums out this week
Yeah.
with like a paragraph about them, and here's a report about the shows that I went to see in Chicago this week. Larry just has great interviews, and he's really good at getting musicians to open up about just like their real life and sort of like the economics of being a musician right now. And so his is another one that I always look forward to. Man, there's so many more, but like
Those are
uh
2 great starting points. I mean, but I think that's important because, now we have to curate more than ever before. Well, again, I really thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this. And genuinely for everyone watching, I enjoyed this shit out of this book. I read it in like 3 nights, slept poorly one of those nights. Because my daughter woke up in the middle of the night, and rather than going back to sleep, I just kept reading it. There is a link in the description to get this on bookshop.org. Follow Chris on social media stuff. And thank you so much again. Hopefully sometime, maybe when you're not in the book cycle, I can have you back on and we can pick a more specific topic or band and talk about it, because I would love to
I would love
learn
that.
more from you.
This was super fun, and I hope that for your viewers it was a nice little respite from like dystopia.
That we need it. That's the main role of music in my life these days. It's like It's there for that purpose. So I'm glad to have you provide that respite.
Cool. Well, thanks so
Awesome.
much for having me on. It's a
Thanks so
great
much, Chris.
privilege.
Thank you. Guys, everyone, do check out this book. It's genuinely good. Like, you guys know that I like books. You know that that's a thing that I enjoy, but I really like this one. Again, there's a link in the description. You can check it out. I would recommend bookshop.org.